What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Adventures in DevOps. Joining me in the studio today, my co-host Jonathan Hall.
What's up, guys?
And today, our special guest, we have with us Doug Newman from RPO. How are you, Doug?
I'm doing great, Will. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. I'm looking forward to this conversation. So, to give the listeners a little context, do you want to tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, sure. I am a career software engineer. Worked at startups, worked at big companies like Microsoft. I've written code. I've led software teams. I'm probably better at leading than actually coding. And I'm not that good at leading, Will. But all that said, I do have production code out there these days, and it's fun. It's a joy. So. From a DevOps perspective, I think I come to DevOps more from the dev side than the ops side, but I've spent a ton of time working on cloud infrastructures and building out operational infrastructure. So kind of have a pretty good sense for how that gets done these days as well.
Right on. Speaking of cloud infrastructure, we're going to be talking about disaster recovery today. So
I don't know anything about that, so I'm looking forward to learn. I mean, I think that's what happens when I leave the room.
Right? Right.
The disaster part or the recovery
I'm
part?
the disaster part. The recovery happens after I leave.
It's a tag team operation, Teamwork makes the dream work. So seriously, though, I mean, I run in AWS. I have my servers in multiple regions according to AWS best practices. Why would I need to think about disaster recovery?
Yeah, so just a little context in general. I am a founder of a startup these days that builds a disaster recovery solution for AWS, and so that's I believe why you invited me, Will, to come join you guys here today is to kind of talk.
Oh, that's right.
That's right. And fundamentally, I think resilience is something that everybody builds for, they aspire for, they hope that they have achieved, yet everybody still seems to have outages. And disaster recovery is kind of part of your strategy for achieving resilience and being able to recover from these outages, especially the big ones, the most existential ones that can oftentimes be threats to the continuity of a business. So in general, we think of resilience as having two halves. There's high availability and there's disaster recovery. High availability is what you build into your workload so that if bad things happen, your system doesn't go down. Disaster recovery is what you enable so that if you go down despite that high availability, you can always get back up. And in a lot of ways, it's kind of like insurance.
Yeah, I don't have that either.
Right.
I'm kidding.
Yeah.
I'm kidding. No, so disaster recovery, to put it in a little practical application, we talk about high availability. We run in US East 1, because that's where y'all run too, right? Everything's in US East 1 in AWS.
Well, our workload is a multi-region active workload across 3 regions, including US East 1, which is perhaps the least reliable region that we could have chosen.
No.
Yes. It has a reputation for sometimes going down.
Oh, damn it. So high availability is all about using the multiple availability zones in a specific region. And then disaster recovery involves having a way to fail over to a different region should the odd scenario of US East 1 not be available, right?
Well, that is a way to look at it. I think in general, high availability is about architecting a system so that you have redundant components that can automatically pick up from each other. Sometimes that's because you're load balancing your workload across multiple systems, and if one of those goes down, the load balancer stops sending it traffic. Other times it's because you have 2 redundant systems, one of which is taking traffic, but if it goes down, your system is automatically going to fail over to the other, and that failover can happen through various means. But in all these cases, high availability is hands off. You don't have to intercede. in order to recover from whatever that event is, the system automatically operates. And to the point you were making, the most common way we see this in AWS is that people deploy workloads across multiple availability zones. Each availability zone is one or more distinct data centers, and that gives you high availability in the face of traditional data center outages. Those are things like power outages, fires. Google had a data center flood a couple months ago. I think that one might still be offline. But those kinds of outage events, availability zones, give you a great architectural underpinning for building a high availability resilience. You can build high availability across multiple regions in the cloud as well. And generally, that looks more like, it's more like NoSQL systems distributed across, large geographies, actively taking traffic in multiple regions at the same time, and eventually consistent across those regions. And I'm throwing out a ton of buzzwords here, Will. I'm sorry that I'm just getting into the weeds so quickly.
No, but keep going. I've almost got bingo on my buzzword bingo card.
Oh, fantastic. Great. With the right architectural investments, you can build yourself a high availability architecture across multiple regions, in which case you're resilient to much grander outages in the cloud than just a fire in a single data center. That said, there's a lot of architecture that goes into that, and that's not appropriate for everybody. And so that's, for many people, where disaster recovery comes into play. We're not going to build the high availability across multiple regions, but we still want to make sure that if a region goes offline for an extended period of time, we can get back online ourselves, and we can use disaster recovery to get us there.
I'm thinking so from so let's talk just a little bit about the actual implementation of that, because there's, I think a lot about when it comes to technology, there's like this saying of there's 3 ways to do it. There's do it yourself, there's do it with me, or I'll do it for you. So if we think about the do it yourself mode for accomplishing this, you kind of touched on that a little bit with talking about like the database specific, where you have databases in multiple regions and eventually consistent, which is a lot of architecture. And that's going to be highly dependent on the skill set, the team that you have, and the different technologies that you're working with. And all of those have to line up in your favor for that to work. But a lot of times we don't get a vote in what systems we're working with. So that kind of puts us in a different model.
Sure.
And I think that's where RPO, your company, comes in and helps. So what does it look like from that perspective?
Yeah, so effectively, the RPO takes single region workloads in AWS and knows how to continuously replicate those into an alternate region of AWS. So we provide disaster recovery within AWS. And we should talk about cyber recovery too, because that's another scenario that we do that's not about regions, but rather about bad actors. But we'll come back to that in a second. But the way that RPO works is you point us at your production environment, and we go scan it and find everything that you're using in there, all of your data, all of your infrastructure, and the configuration. And we know how to back up all of those things using what's built into the cloud. So, there's multiple ways to back up an EC2 instance in AWS, and we know how to do that in multiple ways depending on the service levels that you're trying to achieve with your disaster recovery strategy. There are different mechanisms for doing this with an RDS database. There's different mechanisms for doing this with an S3 bucket. And then there's all this networking and security and identity and autoscaling, containers, serverless, all these things that live around the data. And so we know how to scan all of that, how to back up all those distinct things, typically using the native mechanisms in the cloud platform, and then go restore that into another region um, when you need it. So, and it happens all through automation, whether or not you've got Terraform, CloudFormation, Pulumi, your infrastructure as code of choice. We can recreate all of those environments and get you back online in as quickly as Amazon can launch your systems again, typically minutes. So, fundamentally, it's just backup and recovery. But the recovery is going to happen in a different region, and the backup needs to back up a lot more than the data. It needs to back up the entire cloud environment.
So does that mean you're running duplicates in multiple regions? So like from a cost perspective, did you just double your operating costs?
No, it means that you have to have your data staged in what we call warm storage. So it's not hot, but it's not archived in Glacier where it's going to take you 24 hours to recover it. But in warm storage, and so you're going to pay the cost of storing your data in a disaster recovery environment. That's fundamental to any DR strategy, is having your data backed up in a different location and therefore paying for it a second time.
Right.
But you don't have to have running systems, running servers, running databases. We're not spinning up NAT gateways, load balancers, all that kind of stuff. The cloud is elastic. We can just bring those things up on demand, and that way it doesn't have to impact your bill. A well-done disaster recovery strategy only adds 2 to 3% to the overall cost of your cloud infrastructure.
Oh, wow. That seems like a pretty reasonable cost for having a good disaster recovery strategy.
Yeah, it is. And I'll be honest, it depends on the shape of your data. If you have a bunch of massive data sets and hardly any compute, well, you're paying for the cold storage or the warm storage of the data. The ratio of data to compute doesn't get you to that 2 to 3%. But in a typical workload that we see, it's just a couple percentage points added to your cloud bill to have everything ready to go in the other region.
This is so far out of my field of expertise, it's hard for me to even think of those questions to ask. Which is sad because I used to work for a data or a disaster recovery company. I just didn't work on that product.
Yeah. We did talk though. You mentioned, Will, like the DIY versus have someone do it for you kind of thing. And I'll totally acknowledge, like, RPO is on the have somebody do it for you end of the spectrum. We're a pretty turnkey product. You connect us to a cloud environment, tell us you want to recover in this other location, and we just take over and do that. There are a lot of people, especially DevOps practitioners, that want to build stuff themselves and that have invested in a lot of cloud automation and are trying to figure out how to solve these problems on top of those frameworks. And we work with a lot of those kinds of customers. In general, your infrastructure as code that you would use to rebuild the environment doesn't contemplate data recovery. It doesn't contemplate things like secrets and secrets manager and how you're going to restore those, or users in Cognito user pools and various things that are they're not data, but they're not configuration. They're sort of live in between. And we help people figure out how to reason about those things and how RPO can solve that for them. But if they're going to DIY themselves, we have plenty of conversations saying, well, this is how we do it, and you could go build that yourself as well. And so in general, when we talk to DevOps practitioners about disaster recovery, and they're asking, well, what do I need to do to my CDK investments in order to enable this? It's really about understanding, well, how are you backing up your data? How are those backups going to integrate with your code? How, in order to recover things when you are restoring a system with data? How are you going to replicate your other configuration, things like your ECR repositories where your container images are and stuff like that? And there are ways you can do everything that RPO does and build it yourself. And we end up talking through a lot of those things.
For sure. And I think that model fits a lot to just like the general trend in software engineering over the past, I don't know, probably 10 or 15 years of stop building things that are the same for everyone. Things like authentication. Everyone has authentication, and like diving right into. No, your system's good, Jonathan. It's good. Don't change a thing. Another example that has come up at every company I've worked at is a ticketing system. Whether you use Jira or GitHub issues, or there's hundreds of them out there, or get mad at all of them and decide to build your own, and then 6 months later regret that decision. I think this kind of follows into that model, because you touched on a lot of things there, like replicating your secrets and your ECR repositories. In addition to the data that that you have to replicate in cloud environments, there's a lot of subtle things that happen in the background that you don't realize that you needed to be replicating until you try to fail over. And then those things are continuously changing. So you could do it once, but then if you're using AWS, they introduce a new feature that makes a change to it. And so you've got to not only run your core business and do your core daily operations, but then also follow the AWS change logs to see how that impacts your DR strategy. Or you can just use something like RPO, where that's your core business, and you're focused on that 100%.
Yeah, totally. There was this, a time when AWS in particular used to talk a lot about the undifferentiated heavy lifting of IT. And all of the things that businesses that weren't necessarily technology businesses were having to pay people to do, such as racking servers and wiring data centers, and things that aren't strategic and material to the bank that you're trying to run or something. And so the promise of the cloud has been that they can take over those workloads and let the bank focus on what actually helps them provide better service to their customers. Disaster recovery, unfortunately, was not included in that vision. So banks have to build their own disaster recovery. And what we're doing with RPO is just saying, we can take that undifferentiated heavy lifting off of your plate and let you go focus on banking. Banking's maybe a bad example, but.
Unless you're a banker. Cool. So you mentioned before we started recording here some horror stories that help illustrate the need for disaster recovery. So,
well, I mean, I'll start with like the story that got me into this, which was this was in 2017. This is a pretty famous event, so there's probably a lot of people listening who lived through this. But back in 2017, I ran a software team that was at a telecom. Telecoms like to own their infrastructure. They're kind of allergic to the cloud. Software engineers like the cloud. They like bright, shiny objects. And so my team was pushing workloads into the cloud in an environment where that was not always appreciated. And I was the one standing up in meetings saying, well, the cloud is more resilient than these data centers we have. And we're building more resilient software because of it. And resilience is really important in telecom. There's this 5 nines of availability is the standard that you're trying to meet. And we were doing great with that in AWS until one day an Amazon employee was performing a routine maintenance operation, made a typo, took down S3. Everything builds on S3. It took down pretty much everything in US East 1. And we had a 5-hour outage in the middle of the day. And that was an eternity. And that was honestly the event in my career where I realized that there was a whole new level of resilience that my team had not even contemplated that we needed to be prepared for. And the thing is, Will, like when you're in the moment there and you're 2 hours in on this outage and they're not telling you what's going on, and you're, the executives are breathing down your neck saying, get us back online. And your answer is, I can rebuild the system, but there's no data. The data's all trapped in US East 1. And we don't know, is it going to be over in another hour? Is it going to be a day? Is it going to be a week? What's happening? How long is it going to take? And luckily, historically, I think the longest outages Amazon's ever had have pushed 24 hours in duration, which is a long time, but that's a lot better than 72 hours or what could be longer. But all that said, we were unprepared for that particular event. And so we went after that event, we went and built multi-region redundancy for those workloads to make sure that that particular outage wouldn't happen again. But we were only focused on that one outage, not an outage of the EC2 control plane, not an outage of Kinesis like happened a couple of years ago, the day before Thanksgiving. The other services we were using, we only now were resilient to S3 outages. And that probably really wasn't good enough. So yeah, I mean, I usually start with that particular story, although that's maybe not the most interesting one. It's just a personal one. We talked a little bit, touched on the idea of cyber disasters. And, you know, so much of the conversation that we have with people is about resilience to cloud outages. And that's important, but there's a lot more ransomware going around these days. There are a lot more bad actors that you need to be concerned about. And most people's investments in security focus on keeping those people out of the environment. But the rubber hits the road when you have to recover from a bad thing that happens once they get in. And so I oftentimes like to spend more time talking about these kinds of events. Like there's I think it's MGM casinos in Las Vegas that are currently offline because of a ransomware attack. I don't know, maybe they've gotten back online in the past 24 hours, but it's been days that they can't, as I understand it, book new hotel reservations. And the casino, sometimes I hear it's online, sometimes it's offline. They're losing a lot of money because of a ransomware event. There's a pretty famous outage from a couple of years ago where an employee at Cisco who worked on WebEx got mad and just deleted 456 EC2 instances out of their production environment. It took them 2 weeks to rebuild that production environment. If you think about it, probably everybody listening on this podcast who is a DevOps practitioner working in the cloud has some level of administrative access to a production environment. And you have to give that to people. That's they can't do their jobs without that. But if that person makes a bad decision, or if that person's access gets stolen by somebody else, then that gives them carte blanche to go do very destructive things, criminal things. The person that did that got thrown in jail. But that said, it's kind of too late. They already had the 2-week outage. And thankfully, they had the data so they can recover it. It just took them 2 weeks to rebuild all those systems. You know, disasters come in many different flavors that you have to be prepared for.
For sure. And it's not always malicious. I mean, I think it's human nature to go to the malicious intent first, but it could just be, you know, that you were pointed at the wrong environment. You had the wrong environment variable set on your system, or the one that I've seen over and over again in my career is someone pushes their AWS access keys up to GitHub. Yeah. And it literally takes seconds for someone to discover those on GitHub once you commit and push.
Yeah, it's amazing how quickly they can discover that and take advantage of that. The one that's bit me multiple times in my career is I thought I was connected to the test database before I deleted this data. It turned out that was a production database. And I have, on many occasions, been scrambling to go figure out how am I going to restore those rows from a backup. You know, another relatively recent story, this was last year at Atlassian. They had 2 teams. One, I guess, was responsible for writing a script to clean up some data. Another team was responsible for running that script. And they didn't communicate effectively about the arguments to the script. And so when they ran the script, they gave the ID of like the entire site that need a subsection of which needed to be deleted rather than just that subsection. And that caused them to go delete hundreds of customers' Jira installations, I believe. So, you know, it took them 3 weeks or so, as I recall, to go back and recover that data and get those customers back online. Classic, just miscommunication. There was, you know, nothing malicious intended there, but teams don't always communicate well, and these things happen. So they're definitely accidental at times.
So I'm curious to hear a little bit about, I mean, I think when people hear disaster recovery, I think this, lay people in particular, people who don't think about this as part of their daily job, tend to think huge disasters. You know, the data center floods, tornado, or a hurricane, or you know, some sort of natural disaster, or some backhoe goes over the power line and the whole data center is disconnected from the world, things like this. But you just touched on another topic of like more isolated disasters, like somebody accidentally deleted 6,000 rows from a database. You don't need a wholesale data restore. Um, so on the one hand, it's probably less of a disaster because, you know, the business is still running. Probably it's affected a small subset of customers. On the other hand, it maybe seems like a harder thing to deal with because, you know, if we just had to restore everything, maybe that would at least feel simpler because, you know, we know where we are. We know that everything's gone. Everything has to come back. When you have this sort of isolated thing, whether it's human error or one disk got corrupted or whatever the case is, um, how do you plan for these sorts of cases so that, in particular, so that you can recover quickly? Because, you know, in the Atlassian case, you don't want to restore the whole database because that probably takes hours or at least longer than necessary. You just need to restore a small subset of things. How do you plan for these sorts of
Yeah. So first, I think what you're hitting on is at some level, your recovery process needs to be aware of the application that's being recovered there. You need to know, like, what is the schema of this database so that I can go extract those 6,000 rows and put them back in? How am I going to filter that table down to just the rows that I want based off of what I deleted and whatnot? And so there's a very surgical component that requires you to be extremely deep on the application you're running to be able to do that. And I think in those particular cases, you're going to have a human involved that understands that application. You just need to make sure that you've got everything prepared so that they can do that as efficiently and effectively as possible. So first and foremost, you have to make sure you had that database backed up relatively recently, or according to whatever your tolerance is for possible data loss. And then, you know, it's a question of, do we have a bastion host in place that if we launch a new RDS database and we can actually get into this environment, and then we have all the right tools in place so we can pull those rows out of one database and restore them back into the other, and just prepping through a few scenarios like that and thinking about what needs to be there in order for us to effectively enact that. But you're only going to get so far with that, Jonathan. I think there's always going to be some component of, do we have the right people on the job in the moment that understand how to take this seed of a solution and actually get us out of this problem. So I totally acknowledge that what we do with RPO is at the infrastructure layer. We can't go in and do that surgical recovery of those 6,000 rows. We can recover that entire database, but that might be too big of a hammer for you. But what we do instead is we focus on these, the end of the recovery spectrum that is harder for people to build. That, how am I going to take my running workload out of region A and drop it in region B, pick up with no data loss in just a few minutes and keep going? That's a pretty hard problem to solve that we come in and give people a turnkey solution around.
But even then, in this case of 6,000 rows deleted, you could presumably restore that database, not replacing the current one, but just sort of a backup, and then query that backup from the restored data to get to select those 6,000 or whatever you need to do in that case, right, to perform that surgery.
Yeah. That's the surgery that you have to do. And the best you can really do is just make sure you're prepared for surgery. You don't necessarily know what you're going to have to cut out of the patient, but make sure you've got a scalpel and a clean gurney. My medical metaphor is failing me all of a sudden here, guys. I didn't go to med school for a reason. I wasn't smart enough, but
I watched SMASH enough. It all makes sense to me.
Okay,
sure.
Fantastic. Yeah. And I'm sure that's very accurate
right.
medicine they were practicing in the jungle. Yeah.
It's probably it probably aligns a lot closer to our version of work than not.
Yeah.
Just where it feels like we're in the trenches and getting shelled while trying to do technical work.
Definitely. I think the conditions are less than ideal. oftentimes.
Now, you said that RPO handles a lot more than data.
Mhm.
Maybe we can expand on that a little bit. I mean, suppose I have a Kubernetes cluster running hundreds or thousands of microservices, and I depend on some other services, S3 and RDS and who knows what else. Does RPO take care of all of that, or is it moving towards taking care of all of that? Where does it sit in terms of handling everything I might need to care about?
Yeah, I mean that's where we shine, is that exact scenario. So RPO knows how to back up not just the AWS stuff, but all your Kubernetes config, back up your persistent volumes that you've got inside of Kubernetes, um, understand the relationship between those pods that you're running there and the security and networking and container repos and things that are defined outside of Kubernetes at the AWS layer, and then be able to wire all that back up. So in that scenario, we can extract all the configuration from Kubernetes, go create you a new cluster in another region, push that in, but rewrite it all on the fly so that it, references the new subnet IDs for where these things should be running, and it references different IAM roles for identity and all that kind of stuff. And so that's the big picture. A great example of what RPO is focused on doing is solving that bigger picture problem.
How does this differ, aside from the data aspect, which I understand is its own thing? How does the whole Kubernetes management and everything, how does that differ from somebody setting up Terraform or whatever infrastructure as code sort of scenario?
Yeah.
And maybe the answer is it doesn't. Just most people don't do that. I don't know.
Well, I think it solves a couple problems that people's Terraform doesn't typically solve. So first and foremost is data. When you build a Terraform config to go build out a cloud environment and launch a Kubernetes cluster and push some configuration into it, you typically don't go and say, oh, by the way, I want these persistent volumes created from these snapshots of data. And so that's a big part of the problem. But there's more than just that. And the example I really like to kind of push on is your definitions in Kubernetes, or if you're using the Elastic Container Service in your task definitions, they're going to reference Docker containers that you've probably built and deployed into an ECR repository. In a disaster scenario, a lot of people are thinking, well, I'm just going to run my build process again. And they don't necessarily recognize that their build process has a lot of external dependencies on things that live out on the internet. Frequently, these are packages, open source packages that are being downloaded and packaged together and wrapped into Docker containers that are pushed. Those packages probably 80% of the time live in AWS, and they get downloaded from AWS. And if you're trying to be resilient to an AWS outage, you might not actually have the ability to go and access those things. So one of the things that's really first principle that we solve with RPO is we should be able to recover you without any external dependencies outside of your own cloud environment. So rather than relying on a rebuild of a Docker container, we just back up the ones that you already built and you push them into your source environment, and then we can rebuild, we just restore them into an ECR repo in your recovery environment. So there's, it's really about all that kind of knitting all that back together and making sure that it's a full fidelity clone of what you deployed into your production environment, and just taking away all the considerations of how do I make this portable, how do I make this stateful, how do I be resilient to these kinds of things that happen beyond my control in the event of a real recovery.
I think that's been one of the problems that really highlighted the value for us whenever we used RPO. Is if you build your infrastructure with Terraform, and then 100 deployments later, because every every day, every week, however often your development teams are deploying new features and updates to your application. Terraform's not really aware of that because that happens outside of Terraform. But with RPO, every time that changes, it's replicating it over. And then whenever you do have to execute that failover scenario, you're already saving time because all that infrastructure is already built over in the DR environment. You just have to launch it. But then it's also been updated with every deployment so that the latest version of your application code is over there in addition to the infrastructure.
Yeah, I think that in a world where virtual machines are a significant part of your workload, the state on those virtual machines is oftentimes very important. Sometimes that's business data, but oftentimes it's application code like you're describing here. But it's still important that you have that recovered in your recovery environment to be able to get back online, and that you aren't necessarily relying on people to either by hand or through automation that may be dependent on things outside of your environment, recreating those things.
One of the things we've talked about that is interesting to me is we've talked about different types of events that would trigger a disaster scenario. And I think there's probably some time and effort we could all spend in each of our respective teams just talking about what are the most common things that could happen to our environment, because that's going to differ from team to team, but really talking about, okay, what's the likely failure scenario here and how are we prepared to deal with it? And that takes a lot of time and effort. And I think it's been one that, in my experience, we don't spend very much time doing that because it feels non-productive. You know, it's like, I just think as humans, a lot of us tend not to do long-term planning, and this falls into that category. But there's a lot of different ways where you could be impacted by this and not see the different roadblocks that you're going to encounter until you do like a walkthrough of that scenario.
Yeah, I think, and one way to look at it is what are the most likely failure modes. The other is what are the most catastrophic failure modes, because fundamentally a lot of us work in businesses that are 100% dependent on the technology that we're operating, and if that technology had some form of catastrophic failure, that could put us out of business. So I think you have to ask both of those questions, Will, and I agree with you. It's difficult to find the time to step away from the tickets and everything else is having in a daily job to reflect on those things and to brainstorm as a team and then to choose to make it a priority. And ultimately, that is really one of the reasons why RPO exists, is because in the face of these things, people knowing that they need to invest to be resilient to them, they just also acknowledge that they have competing priorities and they don't have the time to go invest there. And so we come along with a turnkey solution that means you can turn up disaster recovery in 30 minutes and go back to all those other things and then sleep easier at night.
Yeah, and I think one of the things in hindsight that you'll discover is as you progress through your career, I commonly hear people say, "Oh, my manager doesn't give me time to do that," or the business doesn't give me time to do that. And I think one of the ways of thinking about that is the first error there is that you're asking for time to do it. And the assumption from the business side of your company, regardless of what company you're working for, their assumption is that you're already doing that. Whenever they ask you to deliver a new feature, they're not saying, "Hey, stop working on disaster recovery and go deliver this feature." They're assuming that disaster recovery is one of those things that you're just already doing. To use another horrible medical example, like if you go in to have your appendix removed, you don't tell the doctor, "Hey, remove my appendix, and when you're done, be sure and stop all the bleeding and sew it back up and use antibiotics." You just assume that those things are going to happen as part of the process. And disaster recovery is one of those things that from a business person's perspective, they just assume that you're taken care of. So by thinking that you need permission to do it, I think you're setting yourself up for more challenges.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I don't know, Jonathan, if you caught that episode of MASH where they take the appendix out and then they fail to suture. No, that episode doesn't exist.
Cool.
Anyways,
what else should we ask you about or talk about? Any other topics that you think are relevant? What should me, a person who's too stupid to know what to ask?
Well, I mean, I think at a high level, it's really, do you understand your resilience strategy, and is it aligned with what your business needs? And I will say that DevOps practitioners often go to high availability as my resilience strategy. Disaster recovery, I don't need to worry about in the cloud. And the truth is, you need both. High availability can mitigate a lot of outage scenarios, a lot of disaster scenarios. And if you have an environment, an organization that will allow you to invest in significant architectural changes or just different strategies up front that are oftentimes more challenging to engineer, take longer to build, then you might build yourself a ton of high availability into your application. You'll never build resilience to a cyber attack as a high availability. And so fundamentally, you have to consider that particular scenario. You have to consider, how am I going to get back online if the guy sitting in the cube next to me goes rogue? You have to consider ransomware attacks. They happen all the time these days. And so that gets people typically opening their mind to, there is more to what we need to do for resilience than just focus on a multi-AZ strategy, which everyone's really excited to build. And it is a great way to achieve resilience. It just doesn't give you all of the resilience that you need to have. So that's where the DR side of the coin comes in. It's not going away. I think a lot of people sort of figure, well, that's what we did in a data center. In the cloud, we don't need to do DR any longer. And the truth is, the cloud is just a bunch of data centers. And a lot of those same outage scenarios you're susceptible to, regardless of where you're running your infrastructures.
For sure. Not only are they still data centers, but now they're data centers that you don't control or have physical access to. So when there is an outage, you have even less ability to respond than you did back when you were racking your own servers.
Sure. Yeah. And I don't want to go back to the rack your own servers world. I'm very excited that I don't have to do those things. But yeah, we can't just forget about the disciplines that we learned over the decades before we moved into the cloud.
Yeah, I don't think we've ever made it more than like 2 or 3 episodes where at least one of us on the show has said, oh, no, I don't want to go back to a physical data center. I'm happy to deal with the challenges of the cloud to keep from going back into that cold data center.
Yeah.
Well, cool. Is there anything else we should talk about? Well, let's do picks then.
I did, yeah. I have a couple picks. They're both books. I've listened to both of them on Audible, but you could read them too if you like, using your eyes instead of your ears. The first one, it's called The Art of Business Value by Mark Schwartz. And he wrote another book. I think it's the same author who wrote a book I read a while back, A Seat at the Table. Yeah, same author, which is about how IT can sort of have an impact on business. And so this book, The Art of Business Value, is basically trying to define the concept of business value, which we talk about a lot, I think, whether we're doing DevOps or Agile or whatever. Like, does that provide business value? And we have these questions. But as he points out in the book, like, do you know what business value is? I'll bet you don't. I bet nobody at your company knows. It's a pretty nebulous concept when you actually try to pin it down. You try to staple that to the wall, it's like Jell-O. It just falls apart as soon as you try. So he does a pretty good job of explaining why it's difficult to explain, and then helping to define it as well as we can. The most important thing isn't the answer, what's the definition, though. It's thinking about it. So it's a good book to read. I recommend it. And then the second book I want to recommend today, I'm still in the middle of reading it. It's called The Art of Action, How Leaders Close the Gaps Between Plans, Actions, and Results by Stephen Bungay. And I heard a podcast where he was interviewed. I think it was the No Nonsense Agile podcast where he was interviewed. And so this book was originally a business book, but it's gotten a lot of attention from software developers in the Agile community. And so I'm reading it because it's related to that. But he basically looks back to the 1800s in the Prussian military and some tactics they adopted, and how to really succeed in warfare, and how that is beneficial in business. Basically, the idea is you can't plan ahead because you don't know what's going to happen. There's too much random chance, and in the case of war, you have an enemy who's literally trying to hamper your capabilities and disrupt your plans. Hopefully, it's not that adversarial in most software development, but sometimes it is if you're trying to do antivirus or something like that, or any sort of security related stuff. But anyway, so those are my two picks for the week: The Art of Business Value by Mark Schwartz, and The Art of Action by Stephen Bungay. Two arts of books for all the software people out there.
Right on. Doug, what do you got for a pick?
Well, gosh, so I mean, first time guest on the podcast, I didn't put in enough forethought after I hear Jonathan's end of this. I think the pick, I'm going to go with an alcoholic pick here, if I can do that.
Nice, yeah.
Please.
Not that I'm trying to be an alcoholic, but I have some friends that I hang out with too often. They're pushing me in that direction. I think that my pick is Amari today. And Amari is the plural of Amaro. And Amaris are a class of aperitif from Italy. You might be familiar with Campari or Aperol. Okay. These are sort of at the friendlier end of the Amari spectrum. But I've discovered these recently. You know, a few months ago, I made a cocktail that called for one of these, and I bought it. It was not a small investment, but it turns out they're just an incredible complex class of liqueurs that you can make all sorts of incredible drinks from, or you can enjoy them neat, straight up. And so I am here like Thursday night. I'm hosting my friends over. We're having a Mari night. I've got to figure out 3 different cocktails to serve them from 3 different so they can experience this range of everything from, you know, slightly bitter and fantastic and a Negroni like Campari to utter cough syrup that's at the other end of the spectrum that still makes a fantastic beverage if it's mixed the right way. So
does NyQuil qualify as an Amari?
I don't know. Actually, when I first had Fernet Branco, which is one of the Amari that we're going to have on Thursday night, I was like, I feel like this is going to knock me out. I'm going to have a great night's sleep, and I'm going to wake up with no more nasal congestion. So didn't turn out to have that effect, but there was a moment I had hope. So.
Right on. That's cool. I just recently was introduced to those because we were at the we do happy hour with our friends every Friday night, and occasionally they have the distributors come in, and they came in with a peach flavored drink that was like that. Mm-hmm. And it's like, wow, it's actually pretty nice.
They're delicious.
Yeah, for sure. They go down really, really easy. Cool. So my pick, I want to say I picked this book last week, but it was just so good. I'm going to pick it again. Developer Hegemony, The Future of Labor by Eric Dietrich. And the reason I like this book is because it talks about a little bit about how we got into this current working environment and how it doesn't really apply to software development, but there's centuries of this is how we've always done it leading to that. And so it's good at rethinking whether you work in DevOps or software engineering. It's good perspective on how to rethink the value that you bring to the business, and how to just use that knowledge to advance your career. And he specifically talks about the fact that the way most of us advance in our career is through job hopping, and then addresses why that is. But it was a pretty cool book. So that's my pick.
I'll second that. That's a great book.
Right on.
He has other good books too.
I haven't read his other books, but I really do like his writing style. He does a great job of just making the pages drip with sarcasm when he wants to.
He has a great blog too. He's not as active as a blogger now as he used to be, but dadetech.com is a great blog for a lot of that same sort of wisdom.
Right on.
Well, I just want to point out that the intellectuals on this podcast both brought books, and the lunch on the podcast.
If I had thought about liquor, I probably would have recommended a whiskey. I had my birthday party was last week. I'm a whopping 44 now. We had some great whiskeys, so maybe I'll save that for next week.
That's a good one. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, you bring the whiskey pick. I'll bring the cigar pick, and
there we go.
Doug, we'll have to have you back on so that we can just make this a drinking podcast.
Adventures in drunk.
No, adventures in something other than DevOps.
Adventures in. I mean, it's 8:30 in the morning here. That's cool, right? You're not going to judge if I.
It's 5:30 somewhere. Oh,
right?
It happens to be 5:30 here. Oh, great.
Oh, even better. We'll use Jonathan's time zone for the podcast.
Fantastic.
Cool. So, Doug, if people want to get more information from you or talk with you about this or just find out more about you, how can they do so?
Yeah, so I am Doug at rpo.io, and you can always just go old school and send me an email.
Nice.
But most of the community dialogue we're having these days is out on LinkedIn. So
okay.
Track me down on LinkedIn, send me a connection request, let me know that you heard this. I get a lot of unsolicited connection requests these days, and
on LinkedIn, no,
most people try to sell me something. So it certainly would be beneficial, I think, if you let me know you at least listen to this podcast. Probably a lot of people listening to podcasts are going to try to sell me something now. Huh? So,
hey, I listened to this podcast. Can you give me your credit card number?
Right. Yeah.
Cool. Well, Doug, thanks for coming on the show. This was very enlightening, and I think it's one of those areas that we could all spend a lot more time thinking about, especially now, knowing that disaster recovery doesn't have to be the big overhaul that I initially thought that it would have to be. So thanks for coming on the show and sharing that with us. And everyone who's listening, thanks for listening.